bond built over 48 years cannot be dissolved by a signature on a piece of paper, but it took me nearly a decade in exile to realize that some bloodlines are merely contracts waiting to be broken. My name is Arthur Vance, and for most of my life I was the kind of father who believed that leaving a legacy meant erasing my own footprints so my children could walk on smoother ground. I spent 35 years building Vance Timber and Logistics from a single rusted flatbed truck into the largest independent hauling operation in northern Pennsylvania. I worked through the kind of winter mornings that freeze the grease inside an engine block. The kind of days where the skin on your knuckles cracks open from the cold and doesn't heal until April. My late wife, Martha, used to say I was building an empire out of sawdust and stubbornness. And she was right, because every splinter I took under my skin was done with the quiet satisfaction that our 3 children, Julian, Beatrice, and Vance Jr., would never know the hollow ache of an empty refrigerator or the humiliation of a collection notice. When Martha passed away on a rainy Tuesday in the spring of 2016, the world lost its color. But I kept my chin up because that is what a provider does. I buried my grief in work, turning the keys of the operational daily management over to Julian. Assuming that 30 years of watching me show up every single day without complaint had taught him what it meant to hold a steering wheel straight. What I did not calculate, what 30 years of unconditional parental affection never prepares you for, is the exact moment when the children you carried on your shoulders begin to view you as nothing more than an unpaid administrative obstacle standing between them and a liquidity event. It happens slowly, then all at once, the way a rotted retaining wall gives way after a hard freeze. By 2018, Julian had convinced his siblings that my traditional methods were archaic, that my insistence on keeping our long-term drivers on full benefits was holding the company back from modern growth, and that an aging man grieving his wife belonged in a comfortable chair, out of the way. They didn't lock me out with shouting or anger. They did it with folders, legal jargon, and the smooth, rehearsed voices of corporate consultants they hired with my own money. They presented me with an early retirement restructuring agreement during a Sunday dinner that Beatrice had cooked, passing the gravy boat while casually explaining that for the protection of the family assets, my voting shares needed to be transferred into a managed trust controlled by the 3 of them. I looked across that table at my flesh and blood, searching for a trace of the boys I had taught to fish in the Susquehanna River, looking for the girl whose scraped knees I had bandaged on the back porch. But all I saw were 3 junior executives managing a liability. I refused to sign that night, but over the next 6 months, the isolation became an art form. They changed the gate codes at the main terminal on Route 6, redirected company mail to a private post office box, and left me sitting in an empty house with a dead phone line and the distinct impression that my existence had become a scheduling conflict. When the tax assessments came due on the family homestead and the corporate dividend checks mysteriously ceased to clear, I realized the trap had been sprung. They wanted the land, they wanted the trucks, and they wanted the old man out of sight so they could sell the entire operation to a venture capital firm out of Ohio, instead of fighting them in a local courtroom where the family name would be dragged through the mud of public gossip. I did something they never expected from a man who had spent his life in the same county. I packed 1 leather suitcase, took the cash I had kept in a fireproof floor safe under the workbench in the garage, locked the front door of the house my father built, and left. I went west, all the way to the high desert of Nevada, not to hide and not to die, but because a man who knows how to grease a chassis and balance a ledger can always find work where the dirt is dry and the people don't know his past. For 8 years, my children assumed I was either gone for good or living out my remaining days in some forgotten boarding house, running through my meager personal savings while they rebranded the company as Vance Global Logistics and began stripping the marrow from the bone. They stopped calling after the first year. The birthday cards stopped after the second, and by the 5th year, I was a ghost in my own hometown. What they forgot is that trees grown in rocky soil develop roots that cannot be pulled out by hand. In Nevada, I didn't sit in a rocking chair. I bought into a small, struggling aggregate quarry outside of Elko, used my decades of logistics experience to streamline their distribution, and within 6 years, sold my stake to a regional concrete conglomerate for more money than Vance Timber had ever seen in its peak season. I didn't buy a new car, I didn't change my clothes, and I didn't call Pennsylvania. I let the money sit in a commercial account at a Tier 1 bank in New York, cold and quiet and patient. waiting for the winter that always comes for people who build their houses on sand. That winter arrived 3 weeks ago when an old driver of mine, Thomas Miller, a man who had been with me since 1984, and whom my son Julian had fired via a text message to save on pension contributions, tracked down my number through an old mutual friend. Thomas told me what the corporate brochures left out. The trucks were falling apart. The company was drowning in short-term high-interest debt. And Julian had scheduled a closed-door shareholder meeting for this coming Thursday morning to finalize the absolute liquidation of all family assets, including the forced sale of the Maplewood homestead to a commercial developer who planned to level the timber and build a strip mall. I listened to Thomas speak for 20 minutes while the desert sun went down outside my window, turning the hills the color of old copper. I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice, because anger is an expensive luxury that a man in my position cannot afford. I thanked Thomas, hung up the phone, and called my corporate attorney in New York, a man named Marcus Vance, who happened to be my younger brother and the one member of the family who remembered what our parents' graves looked like. I told Marcus it was time to exercise the default provisions on the original corporate debt notes I had quietly bought back through a Delaware shell company 3 years ago when my children were scrambling for cash to fund their lifestyle inflation. Marcus didn't laugh. He didn't offer sympathy. He just clicked his pen and said he would meet me at the Scranton terminal on Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. I drove all the way back from Nevada in a 2012 Ford F-150 that had 300,000 miles on the odometer and an engine that sounded like a sewing machine. I didn't want a plane ticket and I didn't want a rental car. I wanted the highway, the long hours of asphalt, and the gradual return of the gray Pennsylvania hills to remind me exactly who I was before I allowed myself to be pushed out of my own life. As I crossed the state line on Route 80, the rain began to fall, that heavy, cold eastern rain that sticks to the windshield like grease, and I felt the last thread of parental hesitation go completely slack in my chest. Some people spend their whole lives making withdrawals from relationships they never deposited into, and my children had overdrawn their accounts until the ink turned red. I pulled into the gravel lot of the Route 6 terminal at precisely 8:45 on Thursday morning, the truck idling quietly under the dripping oaks, and for the first time in 8 long years, I looked at the sign that still bore my name. The gravel under the tires of my truck sounded exactly the same as it did 30 years ago, a heavy, grinding crunch that told you the ground was solid even if the weather wasn't. The terminal building itself looked tired. The white paint on the concrete blocks had turned the color of wet newspaper, and the large green sign that said Vance Logistics was missing the letter L, leaving it to read Vance Logistics like an old joke nobody bothered to finish. I sat in the cab for 4 minutes, watching the exhaust from my engine drift across the rows of parked flatbeds. Half of the fleet was sidelined, tires flat, yellow inspection tags flapping from the side mirrors like tiny flags of surrender. Julian had stopped investing in preventative maintenance the moment he realized that oil filters cost money and corporate bonuses didn't. My brother Marcus pulled in 3 minutes later, driving a black Lincoln that looked entirely too clean for a coal country rainy morning. He didn't get out immediately. He just sat behind the wheel, checking his watch, waiting for the precise second of our appointment, because Marcus believed that punctuality was the first line of defense against an adversary. When he finally stepped onto the gravel, he carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to sink a small boat. He didn't offer a dramatic greeting. He just walked over to my passenger window, knocked once on the glass, and looked at me through the gray light. "You ready, Arthur?" he asked when I rolled it down. I didn't answer with words. I just reached down, turned the key to shut off the engine, and pulled my old canvas work jacket from the seat next to me. The air outside was 42 degrees, the kind of damp cold that goes straight into the joints of a man my age and stays there until he finds a wood stove, but I didn't feel it this morning. We walked toward the main glass doors of the office building together, our boots hitting the wet concrete of the entryway in a synchronized rhythm that felt less like a arrival and more like a collection. The receptionist was a young girl I didn't recognize, someone hired long after the old guard had been let go to save on health insurance premiums. She was staring at her phone, her fingers moving across the glass with the complete indifference of someone who didn't know the building she was sitting in was bought and paid for before her parents were married. "Can I help you?" she asked without looking up, her voice flat and thin. I didn't stop walking. I just pointed toward the double oak doors at the end of the short hallway, the ones that led to the executive conference room I had personally paneled with local cherrywood in 1992. "They're expecting us," I said quietly, my voice sounding deeper in the enclosed space than it had in the truck. She started to stand up, her face shifting from boredom to mild alarm as Marcus bypassed her desk entirely, his leather briefcase swinging with the sort of legal momentum that couldn't be stopped by a minimum wage employee. The door didn't slam when we reached it. I just turned the brass handle, pushed it open, and stepped into the room where my children were currently dividing the inheritance of a living man. The air inside smelled of expensive coffee, cologne, and the distinct, sharp scent of panic disguised as business. Julian was standing at the head of the table, wearing a blue suit that looked like it belonged in a city bank rather than a logistics terminal, his hair slicked back with the kind of precision that requires a mirror every 2 hours. Beatrice was sitting to his right, her laptop open, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she reviewed a spreadsheet that I could see from the doorway was highlighted in bright red boxes. Vance Jr. was near the window, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the yard with the detached boredom of a partner who only showed up because he needed the signature to clear his quarterly draw. The conversation stopped the exact second the door clicked against the frame. Julian turned, his mouth opening slightly as his eyes traveled from Marcus to me, his brain attempting to process the physical presence of a man he had spent 8 years pretending didn't exist. "Father," Julian said, his voice cracking slightly on the first syllable before he caught himself and smoothed it out into his professional register. "What are you doing here?" "This is a private shareholder meeting. We're in the middle of a restructuring vote." I didn't take off my jacket. I didn't pull out a chair. I just walked to the edge of the long cherry table, laid my weathered hands flat on the polished wood, and looked at my oldest son. "You're 20 minutes late on your equipment lease payments, Julian," I said, my voice completely level. "And you're 4 years behind on your understanding of how this company is financed." Beatrice stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the carpet with a sharp, ugly screech. "Dad, you can't just walk in here with Uncle Marcus. We sent you the formal notices to the address in Nevada. You didn't respond to the trust updates. The law says if you don't contest within 90 days, the majority shares." Marcus didn't let her finish. He clicked the brass latches on his briefcase, the sound echoing through the room like 2 small pistol shots, and pulled out a stack of documents bound in thick blue paper. "The trust updates you're referring to, Beatrice," Marcus said as he slid the first document across the table toward her laptop, "were predicated on the assumption that the underlying corporate debt was held by First National Bank. It isn't. It hasn't been since 2023. Julian took a step forward, his face turning the color of skim milk as he looked down at the signature page Marcus had exposed. "What is this?" Julian muttered, his fingers reaching out to touch the paper before drawing them back like he had been burned. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the small lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hand. "I bought the notes, Julian," I told him simply. "Every single short-term line of credit you took out to purchase the terminal expansion in Allentown, every equipment lease on the new Peterbilts you couldn't afford to run, and the secondary mortgage you placed on the Maplewood house to cover your payroll shortfall last October. I bought them all through Delaware Holdings Limited. I am your sole creditor, and as of 9 o'clock this morning, the grace period on your technical default has expired." The room became so quiet that you could hear the rain tapping against the high glass windows of the terminal, a steady, rhythmic sound that felt like a clock ticking down to 0. Vance Jr. turned away from the window, his hands coming out of his pockets, his eyes wide as he looked from me to Julian. "What does that mean, Julian?" Jr. asked, his voice suddenly sounding very young and very frightened. "Does that mean the sale to Ohio Logistics is off?" Julian didn't answer his brother. He just kept staring at me, his teeth clenched so tightly I could see the muscle in his jaw pulsing under the skin. "You did this to us," Julian whispered, his voice rising in pitch. "Your own children. You went away for 8 years, let us struggle with the overhead, let us handle the labor disputes and the rising fuel costs, and then you come back to destroy everything we built?" I let his words sit in the air for a moment, letting them reveal the absolute vacancy of his logic before I chose to speak. "You didn't build anything here, Julian," I said quietly. "You just spent 8 years trying to figure out how to sell the bricks my father laid so you could buy a lifestyle you didn't earn. Your mother and I spent 40 years showing up for you, And the first time I needed you to show up for her when her mind was slipping and the bills were coming due. You handed me a pen and told me to sign away my rights so you wouldn't have to look at an old man's grief. I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here to take my name off the building before you completely ruin what it stands for. Julian took a deep breath, his hands coming down on the edge of the cherry table, trying to lean into the space to reclaim some shred of authority he had lost the moment the door opened. Father, let us be reasonable here, he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, negotiating tone he used whenever a driver wanted a raise or a customer threatened to cancel a contract. We are talking about a major multi-million-dollar corporate transaction with Ohio Logistics. The papers are already drawn up. The earnest money is in escrow. If you pull the rug out now, the litigation will destroy whatever equity is left in this yard. We can settle your notes out of the closing proceeds. We can add a rider to the contract that guarantees your retirement income for life, an absolute preference share. You don't have to live in Nevada anymore. We can buy you a condo down in Florida, right on the water, exactly where you and Mom always said you wanted to look at the boats. I looked at my oldest son, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of clarity. The Florida remark was the final proof that he had never listened to a single word his mother or I had said during those long Sunday dinners. Martha hated the heat. Her skin couldn't take the sun, and she loved nothing more than the October frost on the ridges behind the Maplewood house. Julian had simply filed the idea of Florida away under the mental tab of things you give old people to get them out of the way. You still think this is a negotiation, Julian? I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming the flat, heavy instrument I used when I had to tell a shop foreman that his crew was being laid off for the season. Marcus, read the foreclosure declaration. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled a second document from the briefcase, this one thin, single-paged, with the official stamp of the Lackawanna County Sheriff's Department already dried at the bottom. Pursuant to Section 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code and the specific acceleration clauses contained in the 2023 security agreements, Marcus stated, his voice clipping each word like a pair of shears, the creditor has exercised his right to immediate strict foreclosure on all collateralized assets. This includes the real property at Route 6, the 42 active vehicle registrations currently held under the Vance Logistics corporate name, and the personal guarantees executed by Julian Vance, Beatrice Vance, and Vance Jr. The sheriff's deputies are currently entering the gate at the main terminal entrance to oversee the transition of the physical inventory. Beatrice dropped back into her leather chair, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes darting to her laptop as if the spreadsheet could somehow delete the paper Marcus had just laid on the table. Personal guarantees, she whispered, her voice shrill with a sudden, icy realization. Julian, you told us those were just boilerplate forms for the bank. You said our personal assets weren't tied to the business lines. Julian didn't look at her. He couldn't. He kept his eyes locked on me, his breathing shallow, his face now completely devoid of that corporate confidence he had worn like armor when I walked into the room. You're taking our houses, Arthur, he asked, his voice losing its professional polish entirely, returning to the rough, desperate tone of a teenager who had crashed the family station wagon into a telephone pole. You're going to put your own daughter and your grandchildren out on the street over a logistics dispute? I took one step forward, my boots clicking against the floorboards under the thin carpet, bringing my face within 2 feet of his. You put yourself on the street the day you stopped paying the insurance on the homestead while you were leasing a Mercedes for your wife, I told him, each word landing like a hammer on a cold anvil. You didn't care about grandchildren when you told Thomas Miller he didn't have a job after 35 years of service because his knee replacement made him a high-risk line item on your corporate health plan. You didn't care about family when you let the grass grow 3 feet high around your mother's grave because driving 10 miles out to the cemetery didn't fit into your executive calendar. I gave you a functional company with 0 debt and 42 prime accounts. You ran it into the ground in less than a decade because you wanted to look like a millionaire before you actually did the work of an apprentice. The door behind us opened again, and this time it wasn't the receptionist. 2 men in dark blue uniforms with silver badges on their shoulders stepped into the conference room, their hats held in their hands, their faces solemn with the quiet authority of the county court system. Deputy Miller, Marcus said, nodding toward the older of the 2 officers. We are prepared to take physical possession of the records. The current management has been formally terminated by the Board of Creditors. The older deputy looked at Julian, then at me, recognition dawning in his eyes. He had been a rookie deputy when I was still delivering oak timber to the furniture plants in Scranton. "Morning, Arthur," the deputy said quietly, his voice carrying the respectful tone of an old neighbor who knew exactly what the history of the name Vance meant in this valley. "Morning, Tom," I replied. "We're just finishing up here." Julian looked at the deputies, then at the stack of blue folders Marcus had piled on the cherry wood table, and finally at his younger brother, who had sat down on the windowsill, his head in his hands, completely broken by the suddenness of the collapse. "It's over, Julian," Vance Jr. said from the window, his voice muffled by his palms. "We don't have the cash to fight a foreclosure injunction, and Ohio Logistics isn't going to touch a company with a sheriff's lien on the titles. We lost it. We lost everything." Julian didn't argue. He didn't shout. The anger seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving his blue suit looking slightly too large for his frame, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the corporate reality he had spent 8 years trying to manipulate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a ring of silver keys attached to a green leather fob bearing the company logo, and dropped them onto the table. They made a small, sharp clinking sound against the wood, a final punctuation mark to the era of Vance Global Logistics. I didn't pick them up. I didn't need to. I had my own set in my pocket, the original keys that had opened the old wooden office door before the glass facade was ever installed. "Take your things, Julian," I said, looking down at the keys on the table without touching them. "The laptops, the personal files, whatever you brought into this room that wasn't paid for by the operating revenue of this yard. You have 30 minutes to clear your desks before the locks are changed and the security system is reset to the original codes." Beatrice was already crying, a quiet, desperate sobbing as she frantically stuffed her designer leather handbag with her personal notebooks, her fingers shaking so badly she dropped her gold pen twice on the carpet. She looked up at me once, her face streaked with mascara, searching for the old man who used to cave in every time she threw a tantrum in a grocery store aisle. But that man had died in a Nevada boarding house years ago. There was no softness left in the room, only the cold, unyielding arithmetic of 25 years of neglected maintenance and stolen dividends. Vance Jr. didn't even go back to his office. He just walked straight out the double doors, his head down, passing the 2 deputies without looking them in the eye, his expensive leather shoes clicking rapidly down the hallway until the heavy glass exterior doors closed behind him with a dull, pressurized thud. Julian remained standing at the head of the table for another minute, his hands smoothing the front of his blue suit jacket out of sheer habit, his mind likely running through the thousands of dollars in country club fees and private school tuitions that were due at the end of the month. "You think you've won something here, Arthur?" Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound humiliation as he looked at me. "You're an old man. You're 72 years old. What are you going to do with 40 trucks in a bankrupt terminal? Run them yourself until you drop dead on the loading dock?" I picked up the leather keys from the table, feeling the weight of the metal against my palm, the cold brass familiar and heavy. "I'm going to do what I should have done 10 years ago, Julian," I told him, looking him dead in the eye. "I'm going to give the steering wheels back to the men who actually know how to drive. Thomas Miller is taking over as shop foreman at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Every driver you fired to balance your quarterly spreadsheets has already been called back, with their full seniority and their original pension rates restored. I didn't buy this company back to make myself rich. I bought it back to clean the grease off my family name before I go under the dirt." Julian didn't say another word. He grabbed his briefcase from the side table, turned on his heel, and walked out of the conference room, his brother Marcus stepping aside just enough to let him pass without making physical contact. The receptionist watched them go with her mouth slightly open, the realization finally hitting her that the name on her paycheck was no longer a decorative corporate entity, but the old man standing in the canvas jacket at the end of the hall. Marcus clicked his briefcase shut and looked at me, a small, rare smile breaking through the corners of his legal expression. "The court filings are completed, Arthur," Marcus said, tapping the leather side of his case. "The Delaware entity has officially absorbed the operational assets, and the sheriff's office has served the formal eviction notices on the Maplewood property development team. They're pulling the bulldozers off the ridge as we speak." I reached out and shook my brother's hand, his grip firm and dry, a reminder of the times when we were boys pulling timber out of the same woods with nothing but a team of horses and our father's old crosscut saw. "Thank you, Marcus," I said quietly. "Go get some dry clothes. I'll handle the yard." When Marcus left, the terminal building became incredibly quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes after a heavy storm has cleared the air. I walked out of the conference room and down the short hallway, stepping through the glass doors out onto the concrete apron. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the asphalt black and gleaming under the pale January sky, and a sharp, clean wind was coming down off the northern ridge, smelling of wet pine and distant snow. I walked down the row of side-lined flatbeds, my boots sinking into the wet gravel, stopping beside an old 2008 Peterbilt that had been parked near the back fence, its chrome grille covered in green mold and its tires half buried in the mud. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the keys, and climbed up the metal steps into the cab. The interior smelled of old tobacco, cold vinyl, and the familiar, comforting scent of diesel fuel. I slid the key into the ignition, turned it to let the glow plugs warm up, and then pushed it all the way forward. The starter groaned twice, a heavy, reluctant protest against the years of neglect, before the massive engine caught with a deafening, rhythmic roar that shook the entire frame of the truck. The exhaust blew a thick column of black smoke straight up into the clean morning air, clearing the carbon from the cylinders, and I sat back in the high air ride seat, my hands resting lightly on the massive steering wheel. A man spends his whole life building something not because he wants to own the world, but because he wants to know that when the ground gets soft and the winter gets long, his family has a place to stand that won't give way under their feet. My children had forgotten that lesson, but the trucks hadn't. I engaged the clutch, threw the heavy shifter into first gear, and pulled the old rig out of the mud, ready to rebuild the empire out of the sawdust that was left.